welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jen, a library aide here at the library, and I'm here with my co-host, Jody. Say hello, Jody.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're here with an author who has brought us an absolutely stunning debut, and I can't wait to dig into it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, hi. My name is Elizabeth Kilcoyne, and I wrote Wake the Bones, which is a young adult gothic horror novel set in my home state of Kentucky.
Very cool. So this is your first novel, but you have published some writing before. So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about your writing career and how it led you to write your first novel.
So I first took an interest in writing, I think I was about 13 or 14, and I applied for the art school in my hometown at the time. And that really just got me started on a career path that I was certain was going to lead me to being a professional poet, which is not quite how it worked out. But I have published in several literary journals prior to publishing Wake the Bones. And then I did theater in college as opposed to the sort of English route that I thought that I was expecting to go on. I got really taken with theater and the stage and playwriting and dramaturgy and all of that sort of stuff. So I put all of my sights on a career as a professional playwright in New York City, which again, as you can see, didn't quite work out that way. But what I learned from college helped me sort of to jump into my first job as a ghostwriter. And from about the age of 20 to about 24, 25, I was professionally ghostwriting romance novels, which was, I mean, as far as first jobs out of college go, it was the best possible job. I learned a lot about writing commercially quickly. I pulled a lot of the theater training that I had done into sort of creating scenes, and it really helped set me up. I had the idea for Wake the Bones, I think it was about 2017. And I'd had it earlier and sort of been working through particularly the characters of Laurel and Isaac in sort of various little one-act plays that I had been writing that weren't quite right. And it was when I sort of harnessed the speculative elements, the horror that I had been so excited to explore, and just wrote it as a novel and did it as wildly as I possibly could, that the story fell into place and became really what I wanted it to be.
That's awesome. That's a really cool way to arrive at sort of at this story. I'm curious, what did the story look like before you added the speculative elements?
Well, it was a series of one acts exploring sort of, and the characters are so wildly different from who they were when I was writing these, but it was exploring the question of who leaves and who stays in a tobacco town when there's no more tobacco. So it was a couple of arguments in a barn, and at one point there was a vaguely sort of pseudo speculative element of a man coming to buy tobacco and talk to their father, who sort of became the devil later on in the story. But they didn't. It wasn't until I was able to really fully harness novel writing, essentially the format itself, is where they finally clicked.
So I'm really interested in where authors find the inception point to their novel. I know that like the question, where do your ideas come from, is super annoying. So instead, I'm asking how the novel started for you. It sounds like it was around the characters, but I'm kind of wondering like what occurred to you first. Was it like a line of dialogue or like a particular scenario or a mood or?
Well, one of the first things, I had a fellow student with me when I was at the Governor's School for the Arts program in 2011, and we were sort of swapping ghost stories from our hometown, and they told me the legend of Rawhead and Bloody Bones, which I had never heard before. and which so captivated me and frightened me that I was like, at some point in my life, this this sack of bones is my future. Like I have to bring this back. So I would guess more than 10 years ago now was sort of the first seed where this story got planted. And then, exploring sort of the play and the relationship between Laurel and Isaac as family and then as friends over the years. But when I really sat down to write it, I started with the scene where they were in the car. If you've read it, where Laurel and Isaac are in the car, right before, I don't want to spoil it too much, but right before things get incredibly gory.
Yes.
So, that was the first scene, and then another scene, which I want to be even more vague about 3/4 of the way through the story, from Isaac's point of view, that starts with discussing the body and whether or not people are meant for survival. That was the second scene that I wrote, and that scene has stayed pretty consistent throughout the entire publishing process. That one didn't get a lot of revision.
That's really interesting to me, that sometimes you can have such a clear vision early on of something that, like, an idea that really like stays static throughout your entire writing process, like even as stuff is changing around it. Like, so did you find that you had to do a lot of revision to sort of like keep that as it was, like the stuff around it? Or
I think I did a lot of revision. I didn't quite rewrite the book, but I did a lot of revision from the first draft, which I wrote in about 2 months, to this final polished version. But I feel like things organically kept shifting around it to make the story more and more what it should be. I feel like I had the sort of skeletal points that were these sort of guiding light points throughout the story, and everything else that I was revising was getting revised because it hadn't quite lived up to those points. So when everything started to feel cohesive with that, that was when I knew that I was getting closer and closer to being done with the story.
nice, very interesting.
I always find it magical to listen to an author's process of like, I did this, I did that, and then it came together. And I just find it, I try to picture it. I'm like, oh my God, that's just a click, click, click. I just find it completely fascinating.
Yeah, it's working with a lot of puzzle pieces. I love the process of revision so much more than drafting. I am a baby about drafting. I just want to get the world's worst first draft out onto the page as soon as possible, so that the story that I'm telling can go on and tell itself. And then I look at what I'm working with and I see what I need from there. So the revision process is really, and it really is where the magic happens for me, because a lot of that isn't something that I've necessarily been taught. I'm not like following something that I picked up in a classroom entirely. It is, I'm learning more from books that I read, other people's books. I learn a lot from other writers' processes. But yeah, it gets to be a little uncanny at some points working with a piece as you're revising it, because the story magic really unfolds at that point for me.
Incredible.
Yeah, it is really interesting to me, because I think so many people think that writing is just like sitting down at your laptop and then, a one-to-one process of like words come out of your fingers onto the page and you write it in order and you write it once and that's it and you put it away. But, sometimes you do have to write the worst version possible first, because you have to kind of get that out of your head so that the real version can come through,
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
do you find that's part of your process? Like, sort of like, I think this kind of relates to like the bad first draft, but like getting it wrong, is sometimes like an important part of the process,
The way that I know that a draft is going right for me is if my characters are basically all sitting around a table telling me exactly what they're thinking at all times and then telling me what they're going to do. I'm very dialogue heavy, and particularly when I'm trying to thread a mystery throughout. The first time that I write the mystery, my characters are just telling me, hey, this is what actually happened. And I have to sort of obfuscate and hide that throughout the draft to make it compelling. So yeah, I never write the first draft the first time the way that it's going to end. I generally don't write anything even close to how the product ends up. you have a lot of sort of things that feel right in your head that when you try to shift them out on the page don't actually come out correctly. There's a lot of opportunity for work and opportunity for growth, and a lot of that I think can only come to me through the editing process. So I would encourage, if you're writing a draft and you're like, oh, this is not going at all correctly, this is not where it needs to be, maybe challenge that in your thought and understand, like, is this the skeleton that it needs to be, or am I just seeing the holes in it in such a way that will allow me to start filling in gaps?
It totally makes sense. Oh, so let's talk a little bit about Laurel if we can, because she's a really great protagonist. And I think her, like, the inside of her head is so interesting. Like, she's a really good point of view character. And I'm kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, her relationship with her home and the land around it, and with her mother, because this is a really important part of the story that sort of like comes out over the course of things being revealed.
Yeah, absolutely. So Laurel becomes the correct point of view character for me when she has tried already to go out into the world and challenge everything that she knows and has been completely overwhelmed by it and isn't sure where to start. So she returns back to her family's home and is ready to do the things that she's seen people in her small town do that have seemingly worked for them, only to find that her home is nothing as she really remembered it. Things are completely shifting, and she has to be forced to reckon with change, whether she likes it or not. In that sort of sense, she's already sort of refused the call to adventure and is being dragged into feeling and thinking about grief in a way that you don't really get the opportunity to entirely until you're coming of age, until you're an adult, until you're forced to reckon with, for Laurel in particular, because her mother barely got to be an adult at all. And that becomes evident throughout the story. And as we learn more about Anna's past and Anna's choices, they're not all that different than the choices that Laurel herself is making, because at a certain point, Anna died very young. So where they differ and how Laurel prevents herself from following in her mother's footsteps towards death, even when there is a lot of danger and frustration and grief, is part of the story. But also learning to grieve as an adult is also learning to sort of say, I'm not sure how to say this, learning to really keep living in spite of it. I think that that's the big thing that I was trying to teach myself as I wrote the book. And I know a lot of advice when you're writing a book is to not write the book until you know the answer to the question that you're asking with the book. But in this case, exploring grief, I called it the big grief book while I was writing it. Exploring grief was really important to me throughout this process, and the revision process helped me with that too.
Yeah, that is so interesting, because I think that, like, her grief is really raw, and it's really you can see her grappling with processing it sort of as she is still being dragged along by the plot, sort of like having to engage with like all of the things that are happening to her in the external world, while also kind of going through this like internal grief journey, and one of the things I think that really helps her is her she has a really great supporting cast of friends. And I think the book has a lot of really interesting things to say about like blood family versus chosen family or found family. Is that something that you were also thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to me to, the first draft that I wrote, I gave Laurel a lot of blood family who were most of them adults around her and who kept solving her problems for her. And that just wasn't a functional storyline. You can't really come of age with that happening. So giving her a cast of people who are all of them going through their own issues, making their own choices, a lot of what they're all dealing with is very similar, and that they are living in a dying town and they have to decide whether to stay or go, or whether they belong or don't belong. But the way that they all deal with that, I think, aids Laurel in her journey, because she's able to go from a person who's very sort of self-focused and only sees what she needs out of a situation where she's not getting what she wants, into watching them making, in some cases, more mature decisions than she's making, in some cases far less mature choices than she's making, but who are also, I think, very unconditionally loving and supportive of her. And I think that she's also a character who is definitely trying to be that way, and grows to be able to do that more throughout the story. Growing up together sort of things, I think that that's an important story to tell when you're telling a coming of age story, because it's very rare that you are doing it in a chosen one, I'm the protagonist, I'm alone in this sort of thing. And I think that Laurel tries very hard to do that, and is immediately stopped by people who understand that that is not really how the world should work.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the imagery that you use throughout the book. I was really taken by your use of taxidermy, both as sort of like a thematic element and this like visual reference that you kind of return to every once in a while. So it's an image, but it's also like a vital part of the story because it's Laurel's hobby and it's something that recurs throughout it. And I'm wondering, what about it spoke to you, and how are you using it in the book? And, how does it relate to sort of how the book treats life and death, if that makes sense?
Right. So I had a lot of fun with this one. I got really into researching vulture culture and people who, it's always been something that I've been fascinated by, because, I do a lot of walking through the woods and finding weird dead things, and, watching the earth kind of do that for you is always fascinating. I know that's a little gory, but I remember just being, well, says the book, it'll be fine. But watching sort of how things decay was really interesting to me. Also exploring sort of death and things that are dead and things that are alive simultaneously is sort of the nature of the woods in general, and it's also the nature of many small towns in Appalachia. It wasn't an accident that I included tobacco as their main form of making a living, because tobacco is no longer a way that you can really make a living in most of Kentucky, although it used to be basically the only way. If you weren't, if you were farming, you were farming tobacco, basically. But then when price supports dropped, that entire way of life dried up, and so did a lot of towns around it. So the relationship between life and death is so present throughout even the setting of the story, that when it came time to tell the story, especially basing it off of a local myth that is reanimated bones, bringing the dead back to life in new and interesting ways, Laurel couldn't have been anything but a taxidermist in the end. I think there's a line somewhere in the book like that says about as much. She had wanted to be a veterinarian because she loved animals, and then she was like, oh, I really just love anatomy. But she starts out, there's a lot of specimens that are preserved and kept away, and in that way she's kind of trying to do the same thing with her mother. So when her mother ends up perhaps not being as static and buried under the ground as she initially thought, and the memory of her mother and her mother's choices are still very much alive throughout the story, everything else shifts as well. So yeah,
that is so interesting. Yeah, because there is this just very interesting thing with taxidermy where you are sort of like helping along the death process, but also fighting it, and there's just this really interesting tension between living and being dead. It's a really cool image for you to have harnessed into the story. It's super effective.
Thank you.
Well, I have one more question and then we can get to yours, Jody, if you want. That's okay. So you did mention a little bit in your last answer of the book's sense of place and your use of Kentucky and Appalachia. And I'm wondering, if this was something that you kind of had like, let's see how I can ask this. Did you map out the setting? Like, did you have a sense of where things existed in relation to each other and how long it takes to get from one place to another for certain stuff? Like, how much of that sort of conceptual kind of stuff did you have to do?
Well, I grew up on a farm. My family has a farm. And so I was really gifted in being able to walk the grounds at this specific part of late June, and take note of everything that was growing. And I didn't really use the farm setting all that much, like in terms of where things were. I used elements from elements of what I know makes a functioning farm. And then I sort of scrambled them up and down a hillside to, I wasn't necessarily writing a map, but I was trying to write a specific feeling in time, just out of sheer love. This book was in part also just sort of a love letter to this specific part of June in Kentucky, because it is so beautiful and powerful, and the smell of milkweed is just like we're about there right now. And it's just been, I've been luxuriating in all the sweaty, sticky, delicious wildflower summer. But yeah, no, I was really, really grateful to my family to sort of let me bring some of the more beautiful aspects of our home in, and then also twist so much of it on its side and write a horror story.
I was really taken at how you combine sort of like this very vivid, almost sense memory in the way that you just described it with like the more fantastical elements. And I really am fascinated by that combination of lived experience with imagination. I just think that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So Jody, do you want to ask your final questions or?
Yes. So you touched upon it with Laurel about taxidermy, but really I was curious instantly when I first saw that on the page. What's your connection to taxidermy? Do you collect? Have you ever tried doing? I know you said that you've seen things in the cycle of nature, of course, but that's where my question immediately went to.
I couldn't not. Once I started really doing the research, I had to get involved. I had to figure it out. And it was really, really wonderful, actually. My family hunts. My dad took a deer. I guess it was year before last or last year, somewhere in the process. And he and I undertook the process together of making a European mount from the skull, which is basically the skull and the antlers attached.
Wow.
And that involved, I don't want to get into too much detail that's unasked for, but it did involve a power washer at one point.
That sounds right. That sounds right.
Getting everything together. I've never had a particularly weak stomach. I grew up cleaning fish and doing the whole sort of country girl thing to a certain extent. Not as far as Laurel did. Laurel is hands full of guts all day long. She likes it that way, and that's fine. But this was a really fascinating process in degreasing, but just understanding anatomy in a way that I had never considered it before. And it didn't freak me out at all, honestly. And the result is really beautiful. And my dad gave it to me as a Christmas present, and it hangs on my wall. It's one of my prized possessions because Lord knows who went through it to make it. So
That is terrific.
But yeah, then it's given me a lot more appreciation for sort of the conditions under which things decay, and a lot more understanding of it. Maybe too much of an understanding. I can tell people all sorts of gross stuff in the woods now. So it's something
that's great.
that I don't think it's something I'm going to put down after putting down Wake the Bones. Like it's just a really fascinating skill set. Good for some people, not good for others,
I understand. I collect as well.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Wow. So I guess like that's a very good segue into a wrap-up question, which is are you planning what's next? Are you writing another novel? Do you plan more books, or what's in the future for you?
I don't know how much I can say officially. I do have another YA novel that I'm currently working on, also set in Kentucky. I don't want to say too much, but it is to do with ghost hunters in haunted theaters. And I'm having a lot of fun playing with sort of the question that Wake the Bones also asked, the question that I don't think I'm finished with, which is what is a ghost?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm loving digging into that again. And then I've got another couple things planned. We'll see what lands and where it goes.
Oh, that's so exciting to hear.
Very looking forward to that.
Yeah, if you want to come back and talk about ghosts in theaters, I think I will speak for the both of us and say I think we're both fairly interested in those things. So, open invitation to come back and chat with us
Man.
again.
I can't wait. No, I'm looking forward to it already.
Yes,
I can't wait to read the book already.
me too. We're going to keep an eye out for that. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It was really a pleasure, and this book is so wonderful, and I can't wait for everybody to read it because it's just like it's an incredible achievement.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this is wonderful.
You're absolutely welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so listeners, Wake the Bones is going to be available as of July 12th. So please check it out at your nearest library or independent bookstore. This has been Jen and my co-host,
Jody,
in conversation with Elizabeth Kilcoyne. This has been Turn the Page podcast, and it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.